I think it would be nice to start with a brief analysis of Professor Legutko's keynote speech. And I would like to start with the issue of the twofold nature of the human person. So Professor Legutko recalls Aristotelian understanding of the dimensions of a human being, the cognitive spiritual dimension and the more political communal dimension expressed in friendship and virtue. How should we understand this dual nature today? Professor Pappin?
I'm glad that we're starting with the easiest questions to keep people awake during the afternoon. I think what Professor Legutko is referring to there is two of Aristotle's general descriptions of human nature. He says that all human beings desire to know, and this refers to, well, he wouldn't call it their cognitive, but their intellectual capacity, the capacity of the understanding part of their soul. It seeks to know and to understand the truth. And the other claim coming from Aristotle's Politics is that human beings are by nature political animals. And this phrasing that Aristotle uses is something designed to reveal what is specifically human. There are other animals, even the bees, which he refers to in the Politics, have a kind of social organization. But only human beings have political organization and desire to know. So these are the two distinctive elements of human beings. And what we can say, I think, about the modern political situation is that each of them is distorted in some way. First of all, the intellectual part, which sought to understand nature, the universe, and sought even to know God, that is now replaced with the instrumentalized cognitive scientific understanding of nature. That understanding of nature, coming from Francis Bacon and the other early modern philosophers, sought to transform knowledge into a source of like physical power over the universe. It sought to have mastery of nature by human beings. So that's distortion number one. And then distortion number two is that we no longer understand politics to be an essential part of human beings, but rather we view it just as a necessary precursor. It's something oriented towards security. It protects us, but basically it otherwise the purpose of the state on that argument is to facilitate rapid scientific and industrial success, which will happen outside of the state. So we no longer have the political language in which to argue. So politics, people are always talking about how polarized politics is, and this has become something that everyone says this, and no one really knows what it means. But Professor Legutko referred to his sense of how American political debates have changed. Well, in politics, we need to debate over things that matter. But in the modern, particularly liberal political understanding, the entire goal is to remove the things that really matter from political dispute. The idea was that this, again, would facilitate scientific action and discovery, and it would work. The idea is that it would work. We can successfully keep out religion from politics. We can orient our activity toward creating, globally mobile scientists, businessmen, people who are not attached to their community, who don't have a stake in politics. Well, the reason that things are breaking apart, the reason that American and European political debate no longer refers to a shared understanding is because, as our missing colleague, not Professor Legutko, but Patrick Deneen once said, liberalism failed. If it were succeeding, this would not be the circumstance. Now we're living in a world in which people feel totally alienated from politics. They're questioning whether the economy, which was built in this way, is actually serving their ends. They're becoming, in some sectors, more radicalized about politics, precisely because they feel that it's missing its heart and its core. So in the end, there is no way of avoiding dispute in politics, but we have a choice between the modern system in which there's no way to resolve the dispute except through alienation and violence and basically a crackdown on conservatives and even stronger enforcement of liberal norms. That's basically what's happening in the West. Or we have to go back to look at politics in a completely different way, which is frankly how it is in Hungary.
Professor Pecknold, do you have any comments of this thread of Aristotelian thinking of Professor Legutko?
Yeah, just to build on everything Gladden has said, the kind of, well, somebody mentioned Ratzinger earlier. Ratzinger puts this in terms of the rational nature of the human person is the basis for the relational nature of the human person, but that is all dependent on the religious nature of the human person. And the classical political anthropology of Aristotle gives us, in the medieval synthesis, this idea that the first thing that falls into the intellect is being. And from being, truth, and from truth, goodness. And that these are the primary things in the human person. Truth, goodness, beauty. These are the primary things in which you have a share. And so that the human person, your political anthropology, is actually contingent on this idea of metaphysical realism, that reality is something that is given and that I participate in with others. That breaks down. It begins to break down in the 14th century. Prior to Protestant Catholic disagreements about political anthropology, you have Occam. And Occam breaks this unity with God. In fact, the Imago Dei is broken by Occam, because Occam tells us, actually, you don't need these concepts of being, and you don't need these concepts of truth and goodness. These are all universal ideas which are pure abstractions. All you need is hechissitas. All you need is the thisness, the particular. And thus he gives us what Professor Sneed talked about earlier. He gives us a kind of atomized individualism in which we actually can only think about the common good as an aggregate of individuals. We can only think about marriage as some kind of contract. We can only think about the nation as some aggregate that we must use overwhelming authoritarian force to control. And so the political anthropology question, I think, has become very, very live, because to ask about human dignity is immediately to raise the question of what is our dignity based? What confers dignity? And it's, I think, very, very telling that the UN Declaration can't talk about God. You can talk about dignity, but you can't talk about God. Well, that's an Occamist problem, actually. That's an atomized individualist problem. And so in order to kind of begin breaking back into a classical and Christian political anthropology, we actually have to talk about not only God, but we need to talk about reality as something participated in, the good as something that can actually be shared, that is shared. If we're going to recover families on which the nation depends, we actually need a better understanding of how we participate in the good by nature, and in turn, we need to understand that for our political communities as well.
My next question would be for both of you is that now we understand what is metaphysical realism and this anthropology. But what is today's dominant political anthropology? Or if there are many different versions, what is the most important, most significant according to you?
I mean, Gnosticism. Gnosticism is kind of the late mysticism which develops around, that atomic expressive individualism that Professor Sneed talked about. Because once you establish a kind of atomized view of the soul, of the self, once you have that, then you actually need some higher thing. But you don't have God anymore, and you don't have anything which really unites us. So all you have is some projection of the will. So I can decide to be a woman. I can decide to be an animal, because my individual will is actually determining, constructing what reality is, because I actually can't participate in it. And so late liberal, or the late liberal Gnosticism that we see in transgenderism and transhumanism, in LGBTQ++ movements, all of this is the kind of political consequence of this anthropology that's broken and doesn't work and has failed us.
I don't do metaphysics. It makes me very uncomfortable. So I'll think about it this way. Think about the question this way. What do we see when we look at political society from the standpoint of a politician or a statesman or a decision maker? And here I think we can draw two different pictures, which we're classifying as the more classical approach and the current approach. In the current approach, I think I would call it managerial or technological. We're taking the person. That's the first thing that we see is an individual or a large group of individuals, and we are uncovering their hidden motivations, basically uncovering the way that they actually work, and then we're manipulating that. So we're looking at people in the same way, in the same technological way that we look at the rest of nature. There are many different movements that are a part of this, from the psychological studies of Freud and later developments within that, to behavioral social science, which seeks to understand the hidden causes behind human behavior, to the phenomenon of marketing and modern advertising, which is based on the same thing. The inventor of advertising in the U.S. was Edward Bernays, who I believe was Freud's nephew, something like that. We published an article on him in American Affairs a few years ago, which I highly recommend, this article and the journal, but highly recommend the article. And actually, advertising is one of the first places that this new scientific understanding of human beings came into play. Well, we want people to think of breakfast in a different way. We want to create and promote the American breakfast. Everyone needs to eat 3 eggs, a lot of bacon, coffee, Nutella on bread, whatever, and the advertisers figure out the best way to promote this, the best circumstance, the right role models, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, these are some examples of the phenomenon. But now this is basically the way that the modern state itself thinks. Well, we're interested in aggregate behavioral statistics. We're interested in GDP as the measurement of happiness, and the essential aspect of this is that many of the key elements of society which the classical or Christian view of the world picked out and identified are invisible. So Dr. Pecknold referred to the inability of the UN to acknowledge God. They had the same problem in the European Union constitutional debates about 20 years ago or more. Can Europe acknowledge that it has a Christian basis, and it's unable to do so? Well, we're fond also of contrasting a world in which the LGBT ideology becomes further and further advanced with a world in which the Christian family or the traditional family is put at the heart of society. Well, these are two consequences of a different way of looking at politics, a different way of looking at people. When you look at society, do you see just manipulable sets of influences that can be, tricked and changed and modified, or do you see essential features? So if you look at society and you see individuals who need to be broken down into behavior, that's the technological late liberal viewpoint. If you look at society and see, first man and woman came together to form a family, and then they formed a neighborhood to take care of everyday needs and the village. And then eventually, when it became large enough, the first statesman made a city. And in the city, we identify the things that matter to us. And we enshrine in our laws recognition of family and church and county and traditions and so on and so forth. Well, these are two completely different ways of looking at the world. And it's clearly going in the direction of the classical one, because we've seen that even late liberalism turns toward identity politics, where suddenly in the US in the last few years, small interest groups have tried to put their identity at the forefront of their political stances and their political viewpoint, so much so, or to such an extent, that they say it's impossible for us to have a public political discussion. We are here to assert our interests. So even when liberalism tries to destroy everything and just get to a level of politics based on technological personal satisfaction, all the other concerns come back because they come from human nature, and eventually they will make themselves known.
I wanted to ask, because Professor Legutko also mentioned two key concepts. One is individual freedom, and the other one is the common good. So I would like to have a clear definition of the common good and why is that important. And is there any balance between the two, or it is a false dilemma between the common good and individual rights or individualism?
Gladden mentioned the European Union, and at the origins of the European Union, you have a very significant debate about the nature of the human person and the freedom of the human person, and you have a very significant debate about the common good. Right from the beginning, the debates between Charles de Koninck and Jacques Maritain and Adenauer, people who had an enormous influence on sort of a Christian way of thinking about the European Union, were actually having very deep philosophical debates about this. And at the heart of those debates was just this narrative about whether or not the person should have primacy, or whether or not the common good is actually the primary thing, and that if you have a rich notion of what the common good is as coming down from God, and we have a share of it at different levels, then you'll actually be more protective of the human person than if you begin with the individual. Maritain was on the personal side, and de Koning was on the common good side, but at the heart of that debate is actually what is the basis for drawing us together as countries? What's the basis for the bonds between us as Hungarians or Americans or French? This is actually the current debate right now. What makes me French, or what makes me Hungarian, or what? If Brussels is tearing down all the borders, who are we, right? And that remains the question of what is the common good. Is there something that is actually real, that we can really participate in it, that has borders, intellectual borders or geographic borders, or are we just kind of units that can be managed and moved around on a map? And so I think we actually have to talk about metaphysics on some level if we're going to talk about what's good for our countries. We actually have to think, well, the good is actually something that is real and we participate in. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So what is the common good?
Can I just piggyback on one thing? It is just a brief definition is, in order to have a concept of the common good, you have to actually have a concept of God as goodness. And if you don't have a concept that God is the cause, is the first cause, God is the final end, in Aristotelian terms, Gladden, Dr. Pappin talked about that our first thing is to know. But we want to know God ultimately. And we want to know God as being itself. We want to know God as truth itself. And we want to know God as goodness itself. And it is in the nature of God to communicate that goodness to the whole created order. And we participate in that common good by degrees. The first common good that we know is actually our communion with reality. And then we know it through our families. And then we know it through our neighborhoods. And then we know it through our political communities. So the common good is actually your share in reality, your ability to participate in something that God has ordained. And for that, you need a kind of providentialist view that God is in actual control over the universe, and you are part of it.
So brilliant.
So
what's the question now?
So,
are we still searching for a definition of the common good?
Yeah, but in a more practical, political sense.
Thank God. Thank God. So there was a controversial moment a few years ago at the Tusványos festival where the Prime Minister mentioned that this now famous phrase, illiberal democracy, that Hungary was seeking to become an illiberal democracy. Or at least that's how it was translated in English. And there was a huge controversy over this because it fit perfectly into the liberal understanding of liberty, or the liberal understanding of what the place of liberties is in society. Simply put, for the liberal viewpoint, there is either a political society which is oriented toward ever more radical liberalization, not governed by any particular norm, except by other aspects of liberalism. So we will allow as much, promote as much liberty in accordance with, or limited by a principle of radical equality. So it only refers to other principles. And then outside there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that is what we call the authoritarian world. And for anyone who had the misfortune of spending years and years in political science departments in the United States, I can confirm this is the entirety of the way that the world is understood by them. So when the Prime Minister said this, everyone said, aha, we knew it. All along, the Hungarians were trying to destroy all liberties. We knew it. Whereas, speaking just as a matter of personal impression of this moment and interpretation of it, this was not the intention. but rather, at least the way that I've heard many Hungarians give an account of their constitutional order, many people here are much more qualified to speak about this than me, is it is a place where, in some sense, liberty is absolutely paramount, but it doesn't come from the liberals outside. It comes from within. It comes from the actual history of the country, in which Christianity fostered a sense of liberty. And this is the point that was missing in the analysis of that. According to the liberals, there's only one system which has liberties present in it. That's liberal democracy. Every other system is authoritarianism. Well, what about Christian democracy? What is Christian democracy? That is a democratic system in which Christianity is understood as the source of those authentic liberties. I'll give you just an example of one liberty which comes in Christianity: not being coerced to marry. This was a huge civilizational achievement, and it's one of the first achievements of the canon lawyers who were trying to decide when marriages were valid or not valid based on coercion. So they used the resources of the Roman law, and they secured this thing. It's still the case today in the world that non-coerced marriages, that is not something that can be taken for granted. And the liberals who have allowed huge mass migration into Western countries have, as we say, another thing coming to them if they think that non-coerced marriages are simply a natural part of society. No, they are in fact an important Christian achievement. So that's part of Christian society. That's a liberty which is not owed to liberals. It's not owed to liberalism. So when liberalism came in the 17th and 18th centuries, what it did was it took a society in which there were already many existing liberties which were created and defended by Christians, and it blew the top off. So liberty of the press is a great example. Liberty of the press never meant radical liberty for pornographers to distribute their publications, shall we call them, throughout the world. That is not what it meant. But you have centuries in which people defend liberty of the press, and that is not what it meant. Were they illiberals? Were they authoritarians? No. What that phrase meant was, this is a democracy based on freedom, but it has a different basis, the Christian understanding of human nature, which creates a certain type of freedom, but also draws the limits. And clearly now we're at a point politically, particularly after the insanity of the Biden years, where we can say everyone recognizes this. Even the mainstream liberals in the United States recognize that that went too far, and that the train went off the rails because there were no rails left. Well, we have to reconnect with those. In Europe, obviously, it's Christianity. There you go.
Professor Legutko also mentioned a very interesting phenomenon, and he called it this American procedural liberalism, and he contrasted that with the European experience. Essentially, it means that we don't have goods in common in a substantive way, only we have basically the rules that we apply and accept, and we play by those rules. But what happens is that now we don't have an agreement on the rules. So how do you see this development of liberalism in the US and also in Europe?
Well, I think that's a good characterization of the problem. The purpose of, let's talk about the European Union. The purpose, according to the Brussels bureaucrats, the purpose of their procedures-based system is to achieve a more rational result. So looking at the political order of Europe, it's reasonable to say that over a long period of centuries, it was challenged by almost continual warfare. It was very difficult to build a peaceful and common culture in such a diverse set of national circumstances. And so the fundamental impulse coming out of Brussels now is, in order to smooth that out, in order to achieve an optimal result, we have to build a harmonious rule system. This is inspired by and connected to the so-called rules-based international order that was popularized in the wake of the Cold War. The trouble is the following: what happens if we ignore all of those real parts of society that I mentioned? If we ignore the existence of and political significance of families, eventually we will have a problem. If we ignore the political significance and eventual importance of nations, eventually we will have a problem. So as much as we might like the human world to operate just like machinery, it doesn't. And so what the rules-based bureaucrats think is a more optimal and rational solution actually creates systemic problems, which cause people to become very angry, and when they do, they rapidly turn back to these real parts of political and social life that the rationalist bureaucrats have ignored. So the point is that the attempt to make human life totally rational, that's what this proceduralist, bureaucratic approach that you're describing does. It backfires. And so here we are. It's clear that it's not possible to continually expand the European Union without limit all across the world. Everyone in the world can be a European following the same system. Why, according to them? Because it has nothing to do with culture, identity, nation, family, tradition, religion, definitely nothing to do with Christianity, and therefore Europe could just be replaced with another word like ultimate rational rules-based freedom house, and things will be great. But things are not great, and everyone recognizes that now, except them.
I think the thing that I want to add here is that universality that liberalism aims at, that kind of managed universality, rules for the kind of global reach of liberalism, is actually itself fake. It's actually a parody of Christian universality. That Christianity actually introduces into the world a way of thinking about the whole world as having a kind of unity, a unity in God, and that the real universality is the universality of Christ the King over the whole universe, and Christianity is something that's truly global. Liberalism copies that, imitates that, but without God. Without Christianity. And that's why Christianity is always kind of the other for liberalism, and why Christianity is seen as a bad source for democracy. Liberalism is the good source for democracy. Christianity is the bad source. But it's also just the sense that, as Gladden says, it's not working, and so what are we going to get instead in Europe? Isn't it going to be something like Islam if it's not Christianity? And I think that's what's coming for Europe if Europe doesn't wake up, is if you continue to hate Christianity, you're not going to get this, universal rules-based, fantasy that you have. You're going to get an Islamic state, and it's coming fast.
Professor Legutko also raised another question, I think, that's significant too, and he tried to classify or explain the nature of democracy, and he called it a partisan democracy. So without having common goods and without the major parties having basically no agreement in any significant question at all, it seems that it disintegrates societies. And do you see any way that democracy can heal itself? Or what's the way ahead to at least have some common goods in which we have agreements and we fight it out on the other issues? Or we just need to win elections and that's the way?
I mean, yeah, you have to win elections. You have to win elections, but I think we've reached a point where elections aren't going to be won anymore on the liberal fantasies. There just aren't going to be won anymore. They're going to be won on more substantive ideas, on, when you look across European countries and what polling looks like on immigration, for example. People want something more substantial. They want real concrete goods delivered to them, affordability. They want good jobs. They want to be able to speak their language and have a memory of the world in which their great-grandparents lived, longer than that. They want to have real substantial goods that they can actually share, that aren't either outsourced to other countries, workers in other countries, or are being brought in across their border in order to replace them. And you're going to need, in order to win elections, you're going to need a new kind of statesman who can actually speak to those substantive goods and not to the procedures which brought us to the place that we are today.
Well, I think that partisanship is an essential part of politics, and the ancient philosophers were adamant that it is completely essential. There is no non-partisan way of looking at human societies. According to Aristotle, the fundamental parties were the oligarchic party, which justified its inequality on the basis of wealth, and the so-called democratic party, which justified its rule over the rich on the basis of poverty and freedom. So it's really difficult to come up with a non-partisan regime. This is another problem with the rules-based bureaucratic approach. Someone is always dissatisfied with it, and yet it doesn't present itself as a political party. It presents itself as the rules. So you have constant battles, for example, between farmers and industrialists. Like, this is a classic partisan battle, but the partisan battle between farmers and industrialists cannot just be resolved by a neutral rule. There has to be some political negotiation. There has to be a farmers' party and an industrialist party. We used to call them the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And they reach an agreement and negotiate and have a compromise. The main problem in recent decades is that the underlying compromise between the two parties in the United States has been a bad one. So from the 90s through now, basically, or until Trump, there was a consensus which was a bad consensus. We called it the dead consensus now. In fact, there was a petition or something a few years ago I think maybe someone at this panel even signed it, called Against the Dead Consensus. Am I right?
Did you not sign it?
I'm not a petition signer. So
I think I helped write it, but I also did sign it.
Admired your work. Anyway, and the synthesis was neoliberalism in economics and at home, and neoconservatism in foreign policy abroad. So that was the consensus that went on between both of the parties. It was perpetuated by the bureaucrats, by the so-called deep state, advocating continually for neoliberal economic policies and neoconservative foreign policies. So we need two things. We need a restoration of real political partisanship, like what are we debating over? We need to make sure that we are debating not over just different sets of rules, but we're debating over who's going to rule a real country with a vision of it. That has not been the way of politics in recent decades. So we have to do that, and then we have to work toward a new consensus which prioritizes family, Christianity, reindustrialization, and peace. But in the meantime, it's going to take a really hard political battle in the United States, in Hungary, in Europe, and elsewhere to get there.
Thank you very much. Our time is up, so I would like to thank you for the discussion. We will continue.